America is bankrupt, and the whole world knows it except Americans. What I'm about to reveal isn't speculation. These are numbers from the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Department itself. Cold, brutal mathematics that show the United States government is technically insolvent and operating on borrowed time. Because once you see the real scale of America's debt crisis, you'll realize we're watching the controlled demolition of the world's reserve currency. Let me start with something that happened 3 days ago. The U.S. Treasury Department quietly released data showing that America crossed $38 trillion in national debt. 38 trillion. But here's what the Treasury report buried on page 847. The interest payments alone now consume more than $1 trillion annually. $1 trillion, just in interest. Not building infrastructure, not funding education, not strengthening defense, just paying the rent on money America borrowed in the past. And that $1 trillion interest bill is growing faster than any other category of federal spending, and it's about to accelerate exponentially. I want to talk to you today about the mathematics of imperial collapse. The moment when the cost of servicing debt exceeds a country's ability to generate the economic growth necessary to maintain that debt. And according to every projection I've analyzed, America crossed that threshold 18 months ago. The United States currently pays an average interest rate of 2.97% on its national debt. That sounds manageable until you realize that most of that debt was issued when interest rates were near zero. As that debt matures and needs to be refinanced at current market rates of 4.5% to 5.5%, the interest burden will explode. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments will reach $2.1 trillion by 2033. $2.1 trillion in interest payments. That's more than America spends on Social Security. That's more than defense, Medicare, and education combined. And remember, that's just interest. That's just paying rent on money America has already spent. But here's what makes this crisis different. America controls the world's reserve currency. In theory, America can always pay its debts by creating more money. In practice, that solution destroys the very foundation of American economic power. I've been in rooms with central bankers from major economies. I've attended closed-door meetings where the future of the international monetary system gets discussed. And I can tell you something that should alarm every American. The conversation has shifted from whether the dollar will lose reserve status to when and how that transition will happen. In fiscal year 2023, the federal deficit was $1.7 trillion in a year of economic growth, low unemployment, and no major wars. That deficit represents 6.3% of GDP. For context, Greece's deficit before its crisis was 5.7% of GDP. But America's situation is worse because Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest payments, and defense spending together consume 82% of federal revenues. 82%. That means the entire discretionary budget is funded with borrowed money. That's not fiscal policy. That's fiscal mathematics. And the mathematics are unforgiving. Now let me tell you about something that happened in March. The government hit its debt ceiling, requiring Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to implement extraordinary measures to avoid default. For 3 months, the United States government operated like a failing corporation using creative accounting to meet payroll. The richest country in human history was essentially bouncing checks to avoid bankruptcy. What's different this time is that America's creditors are starting to lose patience. Foreign governments and institutions hold $7.4 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. China holds $1.1 trillion. Japan holds $1.3 trillion. These aren't investments based on expected returns. These are strategic holdings based on the assumption that the dollar will remain the world's reserve currency. But that assumption is being questioned. China has been systematically reducing its treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $1.1 trillion today. More importantly, China has been negotiating bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely. Oil purchases from Russia and Iran in yuan, even trade with traditional US allies increasingly denominated in local currencies. This is happening because countries see the mathematical impossibility of America's fiscal trajectory and are positioning themselves for the inevitable adjustment. I was in Beijing last year for discussions with People's Bank of China economists. Chinese officials described American fiscal policy as asymmetric risk. Their models show that the probability of a US debt crisis increases exponentially after debt to GDP ratios exceed 120%. America is currently at 127% and rising. Chinese economists calculate that America will reach fiscal dominance by 2028, meaning debt service costs will consume such a large share of revenues that all other government functions become secondary to debt management. When your largest creditor starts planning for your default, you're in crisis whether you acknowledge it or not. But here's what's even more alarming. The domestic political response to this crisis has been to increase spending rather than address structural imbalances. The CHIPS and Science Act added $280 billion in new spending. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act added $1.2 trillion. The Inflation Reduction Act added another $740 billion in spending, all funded with borrowed money. So you have a situation where spending commitments are expanding while revenue generation is contracting. The gap is being filled with debt that requires interest payments that further expand future spending commitments. This is the definition of a fiscal death spiral. But here's what makes America's situation uniquely dangerous. Unlike other countries that have faced debt crises, America cannot devalue its way to competitiveness. The dollar's reserve currency status means that devaluation would trigger a global financial crisis. America cannot inflate away its debt without destroying the international monetary system that gives the dollar its special status. This creates what economists call the reserve currency trap. Let me tell you about a conversation I had with a former Federal Reserve official. He said that in 2008, America could respond to financial crisis with unlimited fiscal stimulus because global investors had nowhere else to put their money. But that's no longer true. Chinese bond markets have grown exponentially. European debt markets have deepened. For the first time in decades, global investors have credible alternatives to US Treasuries. This means that the next time America faces a financial crisis, the standard response of unlimited deficit spending might trigger capital flight rather than attracting safe haven flows. We're already seeing early signs. Let me tell you about what happened during a Treasury auction in September. The 30-year bond auction had to be repriced twice during the bidding process because initial demand was insufficient at the announced yield. This had never happened before in the history of Treasury auctions. Never. The Treasury Department described it as technical market conditions, but bond traders understood what it really meant. The market was starting to price in credit risk for US government debt. The assumption of risk-free returns that has anchored global finance for 80 years was beginning to erode. And here's what should terrify anyone who understands how modern financial systems work. If US Treasury debt stops being risk-free, the entire edifice of global finance collapses. Every bank stress test, every pension fund model assumes that Treasury debt carries zero credit risk. If that assumption breaks, financial institutions worldwide would face immediate capital inadequacy. This is why America's debt crisis isn't just an American problem. It's a global systemic risk that could trigger the kind of financial meltdown that makes 2008 look like a minor correction. But let me turn to what this means for ordinary Americans. Social Security faces a funding shortfall starting in 2034. Without reform, benefits will be automatically reduced by 23%. Medicare's trust fund becomes insolvent by 2031. The irony is brutal. America is borrowing enormous sums to pay interest on past borrowing while allowing the investments that drive future economic growth to deteriorate. This is how great powers decline, not through military defeat, but through fiscal exhaustion. I served as Greece's finance minister during our debt crisis. I've seen how quickly fiscal problems become social and political crises when governments lose the ability to provide basic services. When America faces fiscal crisis, there is no external authority with the resources to intervene. America will have to solve this problem alone, or live with the consequences. Let me tell you about 3 scenarios for how this crisis could unfold. None of them preserve America's current economic dominance. Scenario 1, managed fiscal adjustment. America implements significant spending cuts and tax increases. Social Security benefits would need to be reduced by at least 15%. Defense spending would need to be cut by $200 billion annually. Tax rates would need to increase by at least 25%. These adjustments are technically feasible but politically impossible. Scenario 2, inflationary default. America chooses to inflate away its debt burden through aggressive monetary expansion. The dollar weakens significantly, destroying America's currency credibility. Domestic inflation reaches double digits while foreign countries accelerate their shift away from dollar-denominated trade. America avoids formal default but loses reserve currency status within a decade. Scenario 3, systemic crisis. Financial markets lose confidence in America's fiscal sustainability. Treasury yields spike, triggering a debt service crisis. The dollar loses reserve currency status rapidly. America faces simultaneous fiscal crisis, currency crisis, and financial system breakdown. Based on current trends, I consider Scenario 2 most likely, Scenario 3 most dangerous, and Scenario 1 least probable. When this system unravels, and it will unravel if America cannot restore fiscal credibility, the transition period will be chaotic and economically devastating for everyone. The tragedy is that America's fiscal crisis is entirely self-inflicted. The country has enormous economic resources, the world's most productive economy. The problem isn't capacity, the problem is political dysfunction that prevents necessary reforms. Let me close with a personal observation. The process of losing economic hegemony happens gradually as fiscal strains accumulate, credibility erodes, and alternative power centers emerge. Britain didn't lose economic dominance in a single crisis. It happened over 3 decades. America is following a similar trajectory. The mathematics are unforgiving. The political constraints are real, and time is running out for solutions that preserve both American fiscal sustainability and global economic leadership. America has perhaps 5 years to implement serious fiscal reforms before market pressures force much more painful adjustments. If American leaders continue to postpone difficult decisions, they will discover that some problems cannot be solved through political rhetoric or monetary manipulation. The countdown has started. The question is no longer whether American fiscal dominance will end. The question is whether that end will be managed transition or chaotic collapse. 18 months. That's how long America has before the next debt ceiling crisis, before foreign creditors lose patience with American fiscal irresponsibility. 18 months to choose survival over pride, sustainability over political theater, mathematical reality over ideological fantasy. The countdown has started. The only question is whether anyone in Washington is listening to the clock.